Thank you for joining us. I'm Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director with the High Speed Rail Alliance. And thank you for joining us for this great presentation on the moves to expand passenger rail in Virginia. For those who aren't familiar with the High Speed Rail Alliance, we're a 501c3 advocacy group. We strive to be the most knowledgeable, independent source of information on what high-speed rail is, why we need to build it, and what steps local leaders can take to make it happen. And then we provide people like you and local leaders the tools they need to educate their leaders in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. We take a holistic approach where shared use lines, regional lines, and high-speed lines work together in networks to connect entire regions, not just big city pairs. We're really excited about the steps that Virginia is taking to accelerate their passenger train program across the entire state with connections to North Carolina and the Northeast Corridor. And therefore, we're really happy to have Corey Hill, who is the Vice President of Kimley-Horn and the Program Manager for the Virginia Rail Expansion Project. Thank you for coming, Corey, today. We're looking forward to your presentations, and go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Rick, appreciate that. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all today about transforming rail in Virginia. Before we get into the details of the program, I want to start by talking a little bit about why Virginia got interested in rail to begin with. And really for them, sure my slides are advancing here. So for Virginia, what Virginia's leaders looked at several years ago was just an absolute compilation of constraints that were really affecting the state in many different ways. So when it comes to interstate congestion in Virginia, it was growing at an unsustainable pace, both in Northern Virginia, Central Virginia, the Hampton Roads area. In Northern Virginia, for example, they had some of the most congested stretches of highway in the entire country. The congestion truly was impacting Virginians at an annual congestion cost of over $6.5 billion, with vehicle miles traveled to grow even more in the future, a 15% increase. So they had to do something about it. So the natural thought would be, well, then let's add more interstate capacity. But as they looked at that, they studied the cost of adding a lane between I-95 and I-495, so in the Northern Virginia area of the state. And the study came back recognizing that the cost would be over $12 billion, and the benefit of that improvement would only last them 10 years. So it wasn't a good investment for them to spend that much money and only receive 10 years of benefit. So they then turned to rail and said, well, perhaps rail can do more for us. What are the options there? But again, the problem was passenger rail growth was constrained, largely because of a bridge that connects Virginia and DC called the Long Bridge, which is one of the biggest bottlenecks on the entire East Coast. So suddenly that was a problem to figuring out how to improve the network. Next, they looked at the Port of Virginia, talked to them about what their needs were, and they said the same thing. They've got great plans for growth, but with a constrained interstate network and a rail network that needed to do more, they were going to have trouble reaching their goals of increasing capacity by 40%, with rail having an increasing share of carrying those goods to and from the port. And then lastly, like many states, they were looking at population, expected to grow 37% by 2040 and making it the 10th most populous state. So when they looked at all these things, they said, you know, we've got to do something substantial here. Improvements here and there just aren't going to do what we need it to do. So when we think about Virginia's economy, though, rail is already a big part of the economy. Rail services drive 6% of Virginia's economy, over $73 billion of output, and over 340,000 jobs. So there's a good foundation for rail in Virginia. The question really was how to give it an even more important share for Virginia. Just kind of laying the groundwork for a second on the system in Virginia. So in Virginia, there are 2 passenger rail operators. Amtrak provides intercity passenger rail service, and the Virginia Railway Express provides commuter rail service in Northern Virginia connecting to Washington, D.C. There's 2 Class 1 freight operators, CSX and Norfolk Southern, and then 9 short line railroads in the state as well. So overall, there's about 3,500 miles of rail network in Virginia. In terms of the passenger rail operations pre-COVID, with much of that service returning recently, Virginia was seeing about 55 to 58 passenger trains per day, with a little bit more than half of those coming from VRE, the rest coming from Amtrak long distance services and Amtrak state supported services. Again, the important point though is those services travel back and forth between Virginia and the District of Columbia. They all go over that Long Bridge bottleneck. And so with it being at peak capacity, at 98% capacity, it really was the key to figuring out how to do more, not just for passenger rail, but for freight rail as well. So as the Virginia officials got together, they recognized that they could only be successful if they formed a partnership with those Class 1 operators, as well as the passenger operators. And after some really good, honest discussions and open discussions about how to really benefit all types of services in Virginia, Governor Northam and Secretary Valentine announced a $3.7 billion landmark rail initiative with CSX, Amtrak, and VRE back in December of 2019. They had come together with a construct of a deal, figuring out how to benefit all of the providers in Virginia. Now, it's not so easy, though, as to just simply agree that this is a good idea and this is something that should be done. The hard part is actually turning that into something that you can implement. And that requires a lot of very, very complex agreements about real estate, about operations, about how to make improvements, who owns improvements, maintains them, a lot of pieces to making something like this happen, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. At the same time, Virginia was also talking to Norfolk Southern and Amtrak, recognizing that one of the most successful, profitable routes in the entire Amtrak network is in Virginia, going from Roanoke to Boston. But there's a huge demand in Southwest Virginia for that service to be extended further south into the Blacksburg, Christiansburg area where Virginia Tech is located. And so again, through good, hard, honest conversation and discussions about what would benefit freight and intercity passenger rail service in that part of the state, they successfully announced a transaction in May of 2021, which is in the same process of being put into legal agreements so that it can be implemented. And those legal agreements are expected to be signed here very soon in the next couple of months. So when we think about transforming rail in Virginia, it's a very broad program that involves a lot of corridors in Virginia, not just one. So this map here shows right-of-way acquisition in 3 corridors for CSX, but that ultimately impact other corridors in the state as well in terms of benefiting service that comes from those corridors into the main CSX corridors, as well as the main Norfolk Southern corridor going from that New River Valley area up into Washington, D.C. So it's a comprehensive rail improvement program across the entire state. But while the program involves a lot of right-of-way acquisition, involves a lot of capital projects, which again, I'll talk about in a minute, the point I want to emphasize the most is that Virginia officials recognize that this really begins and ends with service. At the end of the day, that was their objective. It wasn't so much about buying right-of-way and building projects. It was about how do we move more people and goods. And so for Virginia, what they really wanted to get a better handle on was the growth of VRE and Amtrak service. How do they better time serving the markets, and how do they get the opportunity to put trains out there when they want to, as opposed to trying to weave trains into slots where freight service wouldn't be compromised? So it required a much more comprehensive look at service planning, both for passenger trains and for freight trains. The result was pretty tremendous when you look at what they ended up accomplishing. So for Amtrak state-supported service, the transactions with CSX and Norfolk Southern will result in the doubling of DC to Richmond service, nearly hourly service in that market, which is critical because Amtrak really wanted to expand the Northeast corridor further south into Virginia and wanted to capture not only the leisure travel market, but the business market. So incredibly important to have that hourly service to accomplish that objective. Again, they wanted to expand service to the New River Valley at a very important and underserved part of the state. And then also increasing service in the Hampton Roads area, both to Norfolk and Newport News. So really touching all corners of the state. For VRE service, there's a lot of transformation in there as well. For the Fredericksburg line, they're increasing service significantly by adding 6 round trips, but also adding new late night service, which is something that as a commuter rail operator traditionally never gets offered, right? For the Manassas line, same thing, allowing future service increases both in the peak period, but also in the late night time period as well. And then finally, also adding weekend service, which is again, something completely new, but is needed just as much as the peak period service during the week, because that interstate congestion they recognized was just as bad during the weekends as it was during the week. So as we think about that Amtrak service plan, that's a lot of service that I just described, but it can't come online all at once because again, improvements to capacity have to happen to open up that opportunity for more service. So for Amtrak, we're looking at 7 additional round trip trains that would arrive by 2030. And those trains will come online through several phases of after improvements have been made. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. For VRE, again, adding 6 additional round trips to the Fredericksburg line, 4 to the Manassas line. And again, that includes late night and weekend service. So significant growth for both intercity passenger rail and commuter rail service. So with all those service objectives in mind, let's talk about how you create the opportunity for that service to happen. So it started in the CSX transaction with talking about right-of-way and track acquisition. For CSX, they needed Virginia to step up and figure out how to acquire right-of-way and allow then for more capacity improvements because the current rail network was too constrained to meet the passenger rail service objectives that Virginia had. Ultimately, that conversation led to the acquisition of 3 corridors in Virginia. The first being half of the DC to Petersburg corridor, the I-95 corridor in Virginia. And the reason why it's half is because of a very unique concept that we'll talk more about today, which is separating passenger and freight service so that each service can successfully accomplish its objectives. And we'll talk about why that matters here soon. And a major east-west corridor was also an opportunity for CSX in Virginia across the state. And that's called the Buckingham Branch corridor. Buckingham Branch is the largest short line operator in Virginia. It operates the line on behalf of CSX, but it really created a huge opportunity for new service in Virginia. And then lastly, a connection between Virginia and North Carolina. There's been a lot of activity in North Carolina with the Raleigh to Charlotte corridor, and an environmental study had been completed to connect Raleigh to Richmond with high-speed rail. The S-line corridor is an abandoned right-of-way that environmental study identified that creates that opportunity in the future for high-speed rail. So 3 very important corridors. As part of the transaction, Virginia agreed to a 10-year infrastructure build-out between DC and Hanover County, just north of Richmond, that would be accomplished in 2 phases. Over $3.2 billion of improvements funded, committed and funded as part of this transaction. In addition to that, there are additional phases that were contemplated, and 2 of the 4 projects in phase 3 have already been funded as well. So Virginia is already recognizing the benefit of the program and seeking to make additional investment. Again, as these investments are made, VPRA, the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, which is the group that will take over, that has responsibility for implementing transforming the rail in Virginia, will obtain the rights to add that VRE and Amtrak service as they put those capacity improvements in place. And again, in the I-95 corridor, why some of this investment is so important is because there are so many passenger trains, so many freight trains. that is almost impossible for them to operate without getting in each other's way. And so for CSX and Virginia, they recognize the value of actually separating those services so that freight can operate unimpeded in the corridor and accomplish what it needs to, supporting the Port of Virginia, while Virginia's passenger operators can run without interference from the freight trains. It's a very unique concept. You don't see that much in the United States. It's still an interoperable corridor, so each can use the other's lines if they need to, but on a day-to-day basis, they're out of each other's way doing what they need to do. And then again, lastly, in the Buckingham Branch corridor and the S-Line corridor, as I mentioned, fantastic opportunities for preserving those corridors and further developing them to ultimately deliver better intercity passenger rail service across Virginia and connecting with high-speed rail service into North Carolina. So just a few more details on the aspects of the transaction. So again, in the RF&P corridor, we're talking about 145 miles of right-of-way, which includes 44 miles of track that's on the ground today, with additional track to be added. The Buckingham Branch corridor is 164 mile of right-of-way with 179 miles of track that's on the ground out there today. And then again, that S-Line corridor is 75 miles of abandoned right-of-way. But again, Virginia recognized that it didn't make sense to buy just the abandoned piece that's in Virginia. They actually worked with North Carolina to make sure that the entire abandoned section was purchased by Virginia between Petersburg, Virginia, and Ridgway, North Carolina. And in the meantime, North Carolina is talking about purchasing additional right-of-way from CSX from Ridgway, North Carolina, down to Raleigh. So now let's talk about the capital projects. For those that are engineers out there and love to build things, this is what you all care about. So in the I-95 corridor, that's where the $3.2 billion of improvements are located. And they are again divided into 4 different phases with a total of 37 miles of track being committed to be built in the first 2 phases, which includes solving that all-important bottleneck, the Long Bridge. And that will be done by creating a new 2-track passenger dedicated Long Bridge over the Potomac into the district and then connecting into the Northeast corridor. Again, each phase results in the completion of projects and the ability to add more service. And future phases, again, are going to just continue to expand the capacity out there and allow for a greater distance of separation of freight and passenger services. So let's get into those 2 phases briefly and kind of talk about what those projects are. So in the first phase, it's estimated to be completed by 2026, and it involves 6 different projects. In Alexandria, heading down to from the banks of the Potomac River down to again Alexandria, there's 3 tracks on the ground today. A 4th track will be added, which allows for again CSX to have 2 tracks and passenger rail to have 2 tracks. So complete separation in that area. Further south, there's the opportunity to add additional capacity there as well, adding a 3rd track to the 2 tracks that are on the ground today in the Franconia to Lorton area, with a very unique bypass in the middle of it called the Franconia Springfield bypass. This is similar for those of you that are familiar in the Midwest to the Inglewood flyover. It's the same concept where passenger trains will fly over one side of the corridor and come down on the opposite side of the corridor. And the reason for that improvement is to remove conflicts between passenger trains and freight trains and to take advantage of which side of the corridor the station infrastructure exists. In the southern part of Northern Virginia, that section, stations are on the east side of the corridor. As you get further north, it then transitions to the west side of the corridor. So the Franconia Springfield bypass is a critical improvement to take advantage of that station infrastructure and again, remove conflicts between passenger and freight. And then from there, we added 3 siding projects in the corridor as well, which are going to help with meets between freight and passenger trains and making sure that they can easily get around each other. A big part of this program is when you develop a service plan, It's figuring out where those meets are and where's infrastructure needed. Sometimes people will take the perspective that they should just add an entire track the entire distance. That's not always the case. If you do your service planning correctly, you can identify more specific targeted areas for those improvements, which can in turn save millions and millions of dollars in infrastructure improvements that aren't required. Moving on to the second phase. The second phase is where the bulk of the dollars of that $3.2 billion program are located, and it largely sits with Long Bridge. Here again, the existing Long Bridge is seen on the screen. That bridge will remain a CSX bridge. It's not, there are no improvements planned to the existing bridge. It's a safe bridge today, can continue to be used by freight, but a new two-track passenger bridge will be constructed next to it, along with a pedestrian and bicycle bridge that will be a separate bridge as well. So really two structures that will provide opportunities for moving people back and forth between the district. On the other side of the bridge is the connection between Long Bridge and the Northeast Quarter, and that's the LaFont fourth track project. And then again, 3 additional sidings because we're adding more service, we're creating more meets, and we need more sidings up and down the corridor to address those meets. Just a few more words about Long Bridge. I've been talking about Long Bridge as a bridge, but it is actually a corridor in itself. It's approximately 1.5 miles in length and includes not just the two-track bridge over the Potomac River, but 5 additional structures over roadways and the Washington Channel. The cost estimate is roughly $2 billion of that $3.2 billion program. So it is an incredibly complex improvement that's in a very constrained and very sensitive area in terms of historical resources and in terms of impacts on parklands and other important resources. So it's going to be a very challenging improvement to make, but again, is the entire key to unlocking service. So again, when I talk about Long Bridge as a corridor, what we really mean when we say Long Bridge is really those improvements from LaFont, which again connect into that Northeast Corridor, all the way down to that Alexandria area. And again, completion of those improvements from both phase 1 and phase 2 will create a completely separated passenger and freight corridor here that will benefit tremendously. Again, all services. Another key point about Alexandria is that's actually where VRE's Manassas line ties into to then head north. So it's a really critical juncture where you have just an enormous number of passenger and freight trains operating between this Alexandria to DC section. In terms of station improvements, I know there's a lot of thoughts out there and questions probably about transit-oriented development and improving the stations. Again, Virginia was focused on service. They are focused on trying to make sure that there's enough service out there, that the quality of that service is high quality service, that it's reliable, it's frequent, but they're also focused on the customer experience from the station perspective. And so as part of the transaction, there are station facilities that were owned by CSX that transferred as part of the transaction, and work is underway to make improvements to those stations already. So Virginia has a program as part of Transforming Rail in which they are seeking to modernize and improve stations throughout the Commonwealth. Right now, they're focused in the Petersburg and Richmond area, but with more to come in the future. So now let me jump briefly to the transaction with Norfolk Southern and just touch on some of those major features. As I've mentioned a little bit, again, the goal here is to add a second Amtrak round trip train between Roanoke and Boston. That is expected to happen as early as this summer. It then will expand the 2 Amtrak frequencies from Roanoke further south to the New River Valley upon the completion of capital improvements expected to take place over the next 5 years. There is no station in the New River Valley area, and so a station has to be constructed as part of those improvements. There's also a complex yard in the Roanoke area that requires improvements to make sure that passenger trains can get through there unimpeded. It also allows for a third trip between Roanoke and the New River Valley, and allows for excursion service as well. And then finally, the addition of a potential station at Bedford. So a lot of improvements, a lot of benefits expected there from the Norfolk Southern transaction in Southwest Virginia. To accomplish this, again, it's a right-of-way acquisition involving not nearly as much as from CSX, roughly about 30 miles from Salem, the Salem area to Christiansburg in order to facilitate, again, the service objectives. And with those capital improvements in the Roanoke yard and then further north in the Northern Virginia area to create a greater stretch of double track between Nokesville and Calverton, because again, that's where there's a higher capacity, higher demand of freight and passenger service. And so making sure that that service can operate reliably is what's really important in the objectives here. In terms of those benefits to New River Valley, so it's going to provide more frequent, again, and reliable Amtrak service, the goal from the beginning for Virginia, with 80,000 net new riders estimated in the first year. Again, when that train has been operating from Roanoke to Boston, everyone was, confident that it would be a successful train, but it is actually one of the few profitable trains in the entire Amtrak system. So the demand is clearly there, the opportunity is there. It's just a matter of getting the right improvements to make sure that that second train is as successful as the first, and then again, it can reach a greater population area in further Southwest Virginia. So at the end of the day, how did all this get done? It's a whole lot of right-of-way acquisition, improvement, service. How do you make something like this happen? And without a doubt, the number one driver in it was developing a win-win approach. For years, states and Amtrak and commuter rail operators, they've all looked to those freight owners of the freight network to say, hey, can we put more trains on your tracks? And often there isn't as much discussion as one would hope about how to make sure that those passenger trains aren't going to negatively impact the freight trains. And it's often why there's a struggle in that conversation, because there's not enough really understanding about what needs to happen on the freight side when that new passenger service gets added. So with Virginia going into the railroads and saying, we want to make sure we're operating successful corridors as opposed to just successful passenger service, that changed the conversation, the dialogue dramatically, because the railroad said, oh, we're really talking about corridor management here, not just how to put more passenger trains on the freight rail lines. So that was absolutely critical to getting a positive dialogue going. Second, leadership at the highest levels. Virginia's Secretary of Transportation was intimately involved in making sure that the objectives were clear and that the authority was provided at the table for decision-making and helping people understand what terms and conditions had to be met in order to have a successful transaction. Third, honest negotiation. The most important thing with talking to the railroads is truly getting open conversation about what their needs are, how they can be met, and what the needs are for passenger rail and how they can be met. We were able to solve a lot of problems and clear up a lot of misunderstandings once we had that honest conversation going and everybody clearly understood what the needs were, but what the challenges were and what were the right things to address those challenges. Sometimes it's a legal term and condition. Things like indemnification and liability are complicated but important issues. In other cases, it's about adding capacity and making sure that we understand where improvements are needed. In other cases, it's about coming up with a service plan that's realistic, that's not demanding that a certain train has to run at a certain time. If you can be flexible, then maybe you can work out a service plan that better suits everybody. So it's complicated, but it's important to having those negotiations be successful. Fourth, technical due diligence. You do have to understand service planning. You have to understand engineering. You have to understand how to appraise property. You have to understand how to estimate costs to make sure that, hey, if I buy this right away and I'm going to improve it, how much is it really going to cost me? And then with a financial plan, can I afford it? It's not enough to buy right away and then try to figure out if you can do with it what you want. And then rail transactions experience, because again, there are very specific terms and conditions in the railroad industry that matter to the railroads, and understanding that and putting those in these agreements is critical to making sure you successfully close on your transaction. And then fifth, like I just mentioned, it's a whole lot of legal agreements. It's not just about, again, purchasing something. It's about operations, it's about maintenance, it's about engineering, construction, funding, operating agreements with the passenger rail operators as well, not just the freight railroads, and then lease agreements. Virginia now owns property, it owns stations, and it has to have lease agreements for those passenger operators to use those stations in some cases. So it's incredibly complex, but with the right team, the right patience, the right leadership, we were very successful in Virginia, and we're very pleased to get this done and are looking forward to all the benefits that are going to come from the program. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Corey. And for everyone watching, my name is Chris Ott. I'm the Deputy Director here at the High Speed Rail Alliance. We've got several questions that have been submitted. And the first is, will the recent election of Virginia's new governor impact your plans?
It's a great question. And so as part of the Transforming Rail in Virginia program, the previous administration actually created the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority and modeled it after the Port Authority as well as the Space Flight Authority to give it some independence and give it some resiliency and make sure that transition of leadership in Virginia would not negatively impact the program. And so in Virginia, that Virginia Passenger Rail Authority was set up by the General Assembly in 2020. It's a gubernatorially appointed board, but the terms are staggered. And that is how they are going to be able to continue, because in Virginia, the governor cannot succeed themselves. And so every 4 years, you have a change in leadership. So they recognized whether it be Democrat or Republican was not the point. The point was, with leadership changing every 4 years, in order to enter into a successful transaction with the railroads, they needed to show that they would have resiliency and confidence that the program, which was a long-term program, could in fact be carried out. Now, all of that being said, Governor Youngkin has come in. His administration has recognized the importance of rail. Secretary Miller was on the Commonwealth Transportation Board and was a supporter of the transaction. And so it's been a seamless transition with support from the current administration and an understanding of the value of the program and again, encouraging it to go forward. So it's been no problem at all. And hopefully as the Virginia government continues to transition, again, that support will continue to grow as the benefits are delivered. But again, there's the ability to provide that resiliency by creating a rail authority that FRA has actually recognized nationally as a model for other states to pursue.
Okay. That's great to hear. Thank you. And incidentally, we see projects at all stages of development all over the country, and it's great to get these details from you about how far along you are. This is just really great. So thank you. And I think this next question and some of the others show the level of enthusiasm and anticipation of getting these trains running and getting it all in operation. This next question is: will stations have connections to transit, intercity buses, and car rentals for the sake of more seamless journeys?
Yes, absolutely they will. And in some cases, they already do. And in other cases, like at Main Street Station in Richmond, the city of Richmond has very comprehensive plans in terms of providing those better connections with GRTC, the local bus operator, enhancing parking areas to provide EV charging, providing areas for Uber, Lyft, taxis, bicycle opportunities as well. So there's a lot of planning around each station that is continuing to be advanced. It's largely driven by local jurisdictions, but also by the rail authority as well, working closely with them. But absolutely, again, it's not enough to buy right away. It's not enough to build track. It's about the customer experience and making sure people can access the stations in many ways and can complete their trip through that last mile.
Great, thanks. And here is a related question. Do you plan transit-oriented development around the stations?
Yes, transit-oriented development is planned around stations. It's actually one of the most important points about Virginia transforming its commuter rail operator. If you think about commuter rail, often if it's only operating in the morning and the evening, those station locations often end up being really park and ride lots with little activity occurring around them during the day. By expanding the service to more of an all-day service, late night service, weekend service, it opens up for the development community opportunities to put development around those stations in a way that before they couldn't contemplate because the service and the activity around those stations didn't really support it. So that's a huge part of encouraging that development, is actually tying it to stations that have enough frequency to make sure that there is activity generated around those stations. In Chesterfield County, they are already off and running with their Economic Development Authority, planning for development around the Ettrick station. And again, working with Virginia to create that opportunity for development and create all kinds of exciting opportunities, including connections to Virginia State University, which is really across the way from the station, and providing connectivities for the university. So a lot of great things are already being discussed.
Okay, great, thanks. These next few questions are a little bit more technical. The first one is whether electrification is under consideration.
So electrification is not under consideration at the moment. Virginia has been working with Amtrak on Amtrak's new equipment purchase. The Siemens trains are dual power trains. And so one of the bigger issues for Virginia has been the fact that Northeast regional trains have to change their locomotives from diesel to electric at Washington Union Station as those trains carry back and forth between the Northeast Corridor and Virginia. With Amtrak's decision to buy those dual powered train sets, that then removes that requirement to change the locomotives, which is going to be a significant time savings at Washington Union Station. And so Virginia did not feel forced to put in electrification to accomplish its objectives because mainly the purchase of those train sets. But at the same time too, it's a little bit challenging on the technical front to make sure you've got a fully interoperable corridor between freight and passenger rail and dealing with some of those electrification challenges. So it's not precluded, and it still may be considered in the future if it's found to be necessary and the cost justifies it. But at the moment, Virginia can accomplish all of its service objectives with the new equipment and the new train sets that'll be coming online in the near future.
Okay, great, thanks. And this next question is about freight rail, and I know that you've spoken to this when you talked about the separation and the double tracking, but just in case there's anything more to say about the benefits there or the relationship with the freight railroads, the question was, what kind of impact will these plans have on freight rail?
Right. So for freight rail, the key for them is to be competitive, right? The key for them is to have fluidity and velocity in their network. When they talk, at their quarterly briefings of Wall Street, those are the metrics that they're focused on. So when we sat down to talk to them, that's what we talked about with them, is how are we going to make improvements to make them more competitive, to improve their fluidity, improve their velocity. That really got their attention. And so it was critical for Virginia because the Port of Virginia is a major driver in Virginia's economic engine. So recognizing that adding interstate capacity was not an investment that was going to return enough benefit, it was important to sit down and talk to the freights about how do we get better opportunities with the Port of Virginia? How do we take passenger trains out of the way to improve their reliability and their capacity? And how do we make them, again, more competitive so that that freight wants to come into the Port of Virginia as opposed to a competing port somewhere else on the East Coast? So those were some of the key drivers in making sure that we got just as much benefit by creating opportunities for a competitive freight network as the opportunities we were getting by creating a competitive passenger network.
Okay, great. And how about dispatching? Who will handle the dispatching?
So in terms of dispatching, CSX will continue to dispatch the corridor while we're building the capacity improvements. As we get to separation in areas like that Alexandria to DC portion, Amtrak will take over as the dispatcher.
Okay, great. And the next question asked about proposed service to, and I think you touched on a couple of these places, but let me just, the question is, what's the status of proposed passenger service to Christiansburg, Blacksburg, and Virginia Tech?
Right. So currently there is the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. They're again close to closing the transaction with Norfolk Southern, but as I mentioned, they then actually have to go build a station, right, and build an opportunity for the trains to lay over and be serviced. And so they've already conducted a feasibility study, which has started to get that public feedback on that station location and start to plan for advancing that improvement. Their next step will be then to advance into an environmental study, and again, further develop those improvements and make that project happen as early in the near future as they can, again, in that 2026 timeframe. So the project's already under development, anticipating the completion of the transaction here very soon, and look for more information out there, again, from the environmental study as it continues through the development process.
Great, thanks. And we have one more question about your mention of the S-Line. How is coordination with North Carolina progressing on that Southeast high-speed rail corridor known as the S-Line?
Yeah, so Virginia and North Carolina have a great relationship. They've worked together for many, many years through the Virginia-North Carolina High-Speed Rail Compact and through other venues. And so they are constantly in communication with one another. North Carolina, as I mentioned, is working on finishing their acquisition of right-of-way to complete that connection between Richmond and Raleigh. And they have jointly applied for an FRA CRISI grant and are hoping to hear within the next month if that CRISI grant application gets awarded funding, and that funding will go towards preliminary engineering for the S-Line corridor. So there's a really exciting opportunity to develop the S-Line with the completion of right-of-way transactions with CSX, and then hopefully getting FRA funding to advance preliminary engineering.
Great. Well, thank you. Those are all the questions that I have. Rick, do you have any other questions, or do either of you have any concluding thoughts?
Well, yeah, Corey, so I want to clarify, there's that little piece that sticks down of the S-Line that Virginia bought that sticks down into North Carolina. Does Virginia own that? And if so, what mechanism allowed the Commonwealth to buy an asset in another state?
Yeah, great question. So Virginia actually, through the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, had the legal authority, as actually did their predecessor, the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. It was determined that they had the legal authority to acquire that right away. The Virginia Department of Transportation actually owns a tunnel that connects to West Virginia. So this wasn't the first time that something like this had ever been done. So there was precedence for it. And again, it made a whole lot more sense for Virginia to buy that 9-mile stretch into North Carolina than to just simply close their transaction at the border and then leave 9 miles for North Carolina to purchase. So there was good coordination back and forth with Virginia and North Carolina. They decided that it made sense for Virginia to buy the entire abandoned portion. And again, had the legal opinion and determination that they were allowed to do that. Keep in mind that Virginia not only will own property in North Carolina, but they will actually also own property in the District of Columbia as well, because that CSX transaction actually extends from, again, that L'Enfant area just short of the Northeast Corridor into Virginia and then all the way down into North Carolina. So it is possible. They had the authority to do it, and DC and North Carolina were supportive of it.
That's cool. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for doing this. This was very, very informative and an exciting project. And we really appreciate you taking the time to make this presentation. And we look forward to working together in the future to keep these projects moving. Again, thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to talking to you all in the future as well.